Open Market is sponsored by AdLib, the self-serve DSP solution making advertising easy. What do the world's largest demand-side platforms have in common? They're effective, but they require large annual contracts and spend minimums. With AdLib, growing agencies get a single platform that connects to every top global DSP with no contracts, no spend minimums, and G2's #1 ranked support. That means access to the entire universe of TV, digital out-of-home, audio, display, video, and native without a hassle and with no blind spots. It's incredibly easy to use, plus it can automate most of the work your team spends hours a day doing manually. Get the most powerful media buying technology without the barriers to entry. Check out AdLib at getadlib.com today.
Welcome to Open Market, a podcast about building companies in the advertising industry. I'm Joe Zappa. I'm joined by Eric Franchi and the master adtech networker, Matt Barash.
How you doing?
I am good. The sun is shining. It's been a busy week, and I'm looking forward to Thanksgiving pretty soon.
Well, first, I just have to note for the public that Matt and I look like we could be cousins, and we also showed up to this call. So we're both swarthy, bald men with beards. We both have glasses. We're like the same height, too. And I'm wearing a navy turtleneck today, and Matt is wearing I guess what I would call a navy sweater. Matt is the sartorial master, so he might quibble with me on...
Crew neck. It's crew neck.
Okay, a crew neck, everyone. But just, Eric feels outnumbered today.
I do, and I had to look up the definition of swarthy. I'm not going to lie.
We could talk about a lot of things. One of the main reasons I wanted to have you on is because, as I introduced you, I really do think of you as sort of the consummate ad tech networker, influencer. And I think you do that through two means, right? Like you're present in the digital sphere, and you have a big Twitter following, and you use that to your advantage and to the advantage of the companies you work with. But you also are very old school, right? Like you take a lot of people out, you're all over New York City, et cetera. So what do you do from a networking perspective to build that influence that you think most people don't do?
Where do we start here? I mean, I think that we are in the people business, first and foremost. And so while ad tech is the industry we work in, it doesn't matter what you do. You are competing for people's time and attention, whether you are buying something, selling something, partnering, doesn't matter. I think it's important to be relevant. And so when I think about my position and, what I do really well, I think it's really connecting with people and understanding who they are, understanding their goals and objectives, understanding what their challenges are, understanding how to help them provide solves for it. But most importantly, every one of my social handles says you can observe a lot by watching. And so I like to pay attention and listen. And I think the art of listening is really important. And that's the part that people don't necessarily recognize. I think when you're scrolling a timeline or you're sitting at at an event, it's really about finding those inputs that help you to formulate better outputs when you're having those conversations with people and connecting. So, to answer your question, do I look at Twitter and, going to a conference as being a separate medium? No, I think that people are people. Do I think that I really pride myself in being authentic and who I am because I'm typing out a 140-character message or because I'm, standing in a reception area at a conference? It's very much what you see is what you get. And I think, for 25 years now, what's happened is if you have enough activity and you have enough exposure and you spend enough time with people, you start to fortify those relationships and they start to bring bigger and better things.
Well, one thing I've noticed with you, Matt, is you definitely are proactive. Like you reach out to people. I mean, you guys both did this. Like I met both of you via Twitter and you both just reached out at different junctures being like, hey, you said an interesting thing.
I met Matt via Twitter.
Oh, really?
We first connected on Twitter when Twitter was very, very early. It was probably 09-ish.
You want to tell the story? Because I remember how I first met you in real life.
I think we connected on Twitter. I know we had some common interests because back then, Twitter was a bit of a free-for-all. We grabbed coffee one day at Pershing Square, and it's got to be 09, I think.
It was way back when. And if memory serves, I think you tried to hire me on the spot. And, I think that was one And number two was, Eric, Joe and I may look alike, but you and I share something really special, which is the same birthday, right? And I have no idea how that ever came up in that first meeting. It was like, it's like a random thing you learn on a first date, with astrology. But September 10th will always be our, like Eric is like literally my first text on September 10th every year.
Likewise. So yeah, Twitter is where it all starts. Anyway, go ahead, Joe.
Well, I was just noting that, like, I have a distinct philosophy around this, which is obviously using digital channels to build a network, build influence. And I really agree with what Matt said about the importance of relevance. I often put it as attention. Like, so many companies in our space and executives are essentially operating in a silo. Like, they're only talking to their own people and they're not doing anything to orchestrate attention. And I think that's a big mistake. I think you agree, Matt. But one thing I wanted to note on with you is, like, you're really proactive about reaching out to people. Like, you just like see someone new doing something interesting in the space, and I think you're immediately like, let's like sort of bring them into the Matt Barash like circle. And that's like that's an underappreciated proactive effort, because most people, they don't even like someone's post, let alone reach out to them and be like, let's grab coffee.
Yeah, I think there are a couple things to unpack here, right? First and foremost, over the past 18 months or 24 months or so, we've seen digital channels change in terms of, how our industry engages. And so what was, an ad tech Twitter heavy presence feels a little bit lighter these days. And so to Eric's point earlier, having built 14, 15 years of equity into my Twitter presence, I'm not going to abandon it. I still think it's interesting. I still think people are contributing, but I think more people are passive in terms of what they're consuming than active in terms of what they're actually contributing. So that's first and foremost. Those who are contributing are bold, and I appreciate that. They're not afraid to sit there, take a position on an industry that's had more change over the past probably 24 months coinciding with that channel shift. And so people are speaking up. There's a whole generation of talent that's starting to emerge that wasn't in Twitter 1.0, but lives in X 2.0. And then there's a LinkedIn position. And so from my perspective, I think about it in a couple different ways. I think about Matt, the personality, where, you and I can connect over tennis, or we can talk about ad tech on Twitter, but I would never do that on LinkedIn. So there are very different parameters by which I'll engage. Secondly, I think that it's a great way to prospect and feel the pulse of a massive industry that's only gotten way bigger since that first, fortuitous meeting I had with Eric in 2009, when there wasn't even a Lumascape. And if you're trying to navigate a Lumascape, social channels become an interesting way to find a couple of beacons, to find the people who stand out in a very crowded space. The other thing is, the most predictable thing about this industry is change. And so whether it's personalities, whether it's the mechanisms by which it's transacted, it's actually easiest to find that change in real time by watching how people act and react to what's going on in this industry.
Matt, you have a large following, like, on X, on LinkedIn. You're often quoted by the trade press. You seem to have like built a lot of relationships, and I would say you're quite influential in ad tech. How would you go about recommending certain steps to others who might want to increase their own influence?
Yeah. So, look, this didn't just happen overnight, right? I think that, who I am is very much a byproduct of the fact that, I'm a 47-year-old guy who went to college in the mid 90s and there was no internet. And I remember getting into my dorm room at the University of Wisconsin, plugging something in and having access to this whole new world via a portal called Yahoo. And my mind literally exploded. And, when I graduated in 1999, it was the peak of the boom. About 6 months later, it was the bubble. And, I was very fortunate to enter into traditional media, learn the basics of an industry. And then 5 years later, as the industry was starting to reemerge, 2005-ish, I went to go work at 24/7 Real Media. It wasn't just a company, it was a lifestyle for me. I had just had an engagement end and I needed to reinvent myself in some way. And my friends were off getting married and they were off, moving to the suburbs. And I immersed myself in this industry. And, I'm very lucky in that I had a mentor and a guy named Anthony Scaramucci who is loud, he's opinionated, he's got a big platform. And, once upon a time, he told me, shine on the soapbox. And it's true. But, the other great advice that he gave me once upon a time was success, no matter what you go do. Because in 1999, I thought about going to Fidelity to sell, I don't even know what, like mutual funds. I don't know how that story would have worked out. I read a book by Peter Lynch, and he's like, look, no matter what you do, success is going to be a function of exposure and activity, the relationships you build, and ultimately how you leverage that. And that's what you have today. Now, Eric will remember a guy named Ari Blumen, who was my boss at 24/7 Real Media, who was one of a kind. And Ari's whole philosophy in this was, Matt, you're running a business development team for an ad network business. The internet is this infinite source of opportunity for us to, find more and more partners and publishers and, things we could be doing as a company. Go out there and have as many touches as you can. So my goal on any given week for the first 2 years I was in this business was send 40 emails a day, get on 10 phone calls a day. So 40 times 5 is 200 emails a week, right? 50 phone calls a week times, 12 months a year. It's a lot of touches, right? What happens? You end up talking to the founders of YouTube, the founding team at MySpace. Maybe you make a couple mistakes and you send an email to Kim.com asking if you can help him to make some money on his pirated websites. But ultimately, that's the foundation, all right? Then what happens over the next 20 years is those people start to grow up and those people become more senior and you become more senior with them. And so, that's the ability to, send that email, have it answered. That's the credibility you build when you have a company like 24/7 sell the WPP, and then you get tapped on the shoulder by the MySpace team to go launch a business at News Corp, and you go work for some iconic people and you watch how they behave, and then you start to emulate that. And so, what I've learned along the way is activity is really important. Accessibility is really important. I think, I try to respond to everything I possibly can. And, sometimes I think, is that a Matt thing? Because it drives me nuts when I don't get a response every so often. I think authenticity is very much the brand. And then credibility comes with the things that you actually do. And so where if you're talking about Matt, who has an influence in an industry, who maybe, I think the term once upon a time might have been thought leader, right? I think that's evolved. And I think influence is really, today a function of the perception of reality, whereas thought leader is, maybe more of the LinkedIn presence. The influencer is, not just the guy who has a position or an opinion on any given subject in this business, but also the one who will stand there and have the conversation with you in real life and take that from offline to online.
Well, I think that's a great articulation of the strategy, right? And I don't know, sometimes you might have thought of it as a concerted strategy and maybe others not. It sounds like it mostly actually was.
A little bit of both. I think, what happens along the way is you get lucky, right? And so, for me, a couple things happened that were deliberate and a couple things happened that were perhaps a little bit of right time, right place. And so, I'll come back to right time, right place, which is when you start to build relationships with people like Terry Kawaja in 2009. And, 15 years later, as Terry starts to become a content creator and you become one of the people who he loves to poke fun at, in some ways I'm like, I'm blessed, right? Like, make fun of me all you want. You are the most influential executives with one of the biggest platforms in this industry. If you want to highlight me, by all means, I wear that as a badge of honor. And sometimes, I'm like, like you're painting a picture that in some ways I'm humbled by. It's the best way to put it, right? I'm like, they're the icons and the folks on, on the Mount Rushmore of ad tech. And, I find myself in rooms with them, on calls with them, and memes with them. And it's incredibly humbling. And sometimes there's a little imposter syndrome that goes with that. But what it's done is it's allowed me to build and, and to really kind of snowball that perception. That's not easy. The other part of this is, the press is a huge part of what we do, right? And I look at my relationships with the press. I have complete trust in every reporter and every editor I talk to. There's nothing different about the way that I speak with them, which is daily, than any of the conversations I have with my peers, my clients, companies I've invested in, whatever it might be. They're like pretty much on the mark. And so what I see across this business, and I hear from reporters and editors all the time is, I don't understand why executives are terrified of us. And the reality is they're not out to get you. They're only there to be another tool and resource. And so the relationship that I built with the press comes back to reciprocity. And it comes back to conversations that are on the record, off the record, and, talking about the things that are happening at a moment in time where, look, do I have access? Yeah. Do I understand what's going on in this business? Yes. Is everything I do deliberate? Absolutely. And am I very much thinking strategically about what I share and don't share? For sure. And what that does, if you're a reporter, is it helps you to frame a story in a different way. And, if you're Matt Barash, it allows you to pick and choose the narratives or the news stories or current events where you want to be relevant and you want to be associated. And that's a great relationship and a great place to play from.
I think the main marketing problem that individuals in the industry have and companies have is invisibility, but they think it's that they're going to say the wrong thing. Like that is just extremely injurious. It's a strategic miscalibration because that leads them to be silent. And as you said, to be passive, when really, as you put it, the foundation of success, both for individuals and their careers and for businesses is, as you put it, exposure and activity, right? I often say attention. It's like attention, foundation of the pyramid. You just can't do anything without attention. If no one knows you exist, you can't have any opportunities. Attention gives you the opportunity to build reputation and relationships, and then that leads to all sorts of opportunities, which in the marketing sphere might be leads or pipeline or whatever, but it's so much broader than that. It's a much bigger opportunity. If you're able to orchestrate people's attention and earn that, the opportunities go way beyond, oh, I might do a deal with so-and-so.
That fear factor is so real. And Joe, this is what you do for a living, right? You help coach and guide executives to say the right things. But in your travels, let me ask you and turn the tables here for a second. How many people have actually said the wrong thing and been burned by it? It doesn't happen very often.
It happens very infrequently. Our main problem is going to be earning people's attention. It is not going to be that we say something that's going to get us in trouble. And by the way, even if you do quote unquote get in trouble, it's a very fast news cycle. It's a very fast conversation cycle. Generally, it's 24, 48 hours max, and then people move on.
Totally agreed.
Why then that do executives not capitalize on this opportunity that we have, in front of us to use these channels, whether it's the social stuff, whether it's press, to build their influence? Have you ever had conversations around that?
I mean, again, I think part of it's a fear factor. I think part of it is there's an element of, really putting yourself out there. And I think, for executives who do it well, they're pretty real, right? I think, coming back to Terry is who he is and he wears it proudly. It may not land with everyone, but I think, what it does is he's proud of who he is. I am proud of who I am. I think I've gone from Matt the ad tech guy to Matt the dad. I'm very much who I am. I'm Matt now. But I think, along the way, for me to invest time in popping a tweet probably takes 10 seconds on my walk to the elevator or, a minute in between meetings, or maybe, I'm on the subway and I have a great thought. It's not like I'm sitting there typing things out in advance and hanging on every word. There are typos. There are grammatical mistakes. It is what it is. And, the quest for perfection, I think, lives very much in the C-suite. And this is very much an imperfect industry. And that's the beauty of it. And so if you're sitting there worried about saying all the right things, doing all the right things, you're probably going to be paralyzed. And I think we find that far too often. The other thing is, look, like, it's okay to have an opinion, and it's okay to, to in a thoughtful way and engage in some discourse and, say, hey, I'm the contrarian, or, hey, I'm going to zig when you're zagging, or I may not agree with what you're thinking about, help me to better understand it. Recently, Eric, you and I had an exchange on social where I talked about app level. And I talked about, the bifurcated markets where you've got mobile here and ad tech here. They're very much disconnected. I think that the app loving story over the past 12 months or even the past 10 years has very much been overlooked by mainstream ad tech. And it's amazing. And, from my perspective, when I look at how app loving has started to garner the attention of the industry over the past week or two, and people are like, wow, the market cap is greater than that of the trade desk. How is that possible? Well, these guys are really smart, and they built a big business, and they built it in a really tough space and a really crowded space. And they've had really big challenges like ATT and Apple. And, maybe, just maybe, they're going to come head into mainstream ad tech. And Eric, you popped right back, right? You were like, let me course correct you a little bit. And I appreciate that, right? Because I want to put an opinion out there. And I also want to know how I can be smarter about things. And I love the real-time nature of people coming back and going, hey, Eric is probably on his way to jiu-jitsu right now, and he's typing out a quick tweet response, like, hey, Matt, you should think about this or check out this, and this will make you better.
Yeah, a lot of it is that openness to feedback. I mean, I think to your point, Matt, like a lot of, and to Eric's question about what prevents people from getting in the arena, even executives who make a lot of money and have a lot of influence and have a lot of people reporting to them are just like brittle people. And like, we're scared of feedback, we're scared of criticism. It really, it freaking sucks when someone's mean to you on Twitter, right? No matter how established and how much money you have. And you do have to step back from it and make the rational analysis and say, the benefits I'm getting from this are vast. And if once every other month someone's mean to me on Twitter, it's worth it. But it does sting sometimes. And I think you need to be able to do that cost benefit analysis.
I mean, look, if you're just going to be the guy who's the Grinch, then you probably shouldn't be out there messaging, right? I think you also want to support people and see your friends win. And I don't see a lot of it. I see some of it, but I don't see enough of it. And so you see it when there's a strategic outcome, but you don't always see it when your competitors do something great. I have no problem, working for one SSP and going, wow, SSPs, B and C in this space are doing cool stuff. Like, let me hit a like button, or let me be like, congrats. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that gets lost in the shuffle, right? Like, we're all competitive in some way, but ultimately, like I said, it's a people business. And I think it's okay to support your peers.
Yeah, that makes sense. Joe, just to go back to what you just said about, folks who might be in, like really big jobs and have a lot of money or make a lot of money, I can imagine they might actually be operating from a position of fear. And they have, arguably more to lose than, somebody that's just beginning their career or, like midway through their career and can just like pop off, right? But then you see the anomalies of the Vanderhooks who over the course of the past, few months have completely transformed, I think, the reputation and image of Viant and themselves by just being like foot on the gas and, super prolific and saying smart things. So I would point to them as the example of, hey, if you really just, again, take the governor off to keep the bad car analogies going, what could be? I mean, look at the stop, right? You pointed that out this morning.
It's a great example. And I think, look, it's one of those things where, to Joe's point earlier, if you say the wrong thing, like, people forget right away. I also think that, it depends on like what your talk track is. And so for me, I don't ever get into the weeds in any type of social discourse. I don't see the benefit, right? I don't want to be the smartest guy in the room. I don't want to get into like
Until he's unravels. It unravels. You can't debate like the nuances of header bidding over Twitter. Like it always falls apart because of the nature of the medium.
and so that comes back to the time suck, right? Where, I don't want to find myself, being like, I've got to answer this or I've got to answer that. I think I generally keep it high level and, maybe it's like a back and a forth, but it's not a black hole. And that's really important because, I think that understanding time management here, yeah, I mean, we're all busy, but it doesn't take a lot of time because, again, it's a one-to-many medium. And, when I'm in the arena or, in a real world environment at a conference, at an event, traveling and a meeting, that's a one-to-one environment. And so, there are different strategies for each. And I think, again, it comes back to the investment and, what the goal is, right? And so if the goal is to, get a broad thought around curation out there, Twitter is a great place. If I want to get into the guts of what it really means, then that's a hallway conversation when I'm standing around, at a coffee break.
Do you think companies that don't do this can be taught to do this? And how have you navigated those situations where you might be advising someone or you might be part of a team and you're like, hey guys, we're invisible out there. How do we change that?
Yeah. I mean, look, no, I don't think it can be taught. You have to lean in, you have to take chances, and you have to see what works for you. There's no playbook where it's like a one size fits all. This is the tone, this is the content you should create. I sit on the advisory board of an early stage company, and the founder has decided that he's going to start to post daily. And he recently posted something that said, calling all CROs. And I was like, I don't get it. You sound like something a kid in a schoolyard would say. What does that mean? And so, again, you have to find that you have credibility in market, and how do you establish that? I think I look back at my career and, I think about the things that I've done that establish that credibility outside of who Matt is in a social space. And so I look at the businesses that have, had positive outcomes, have scaled, have grown, and the contribution that I've made and the things that I've been able to accomplish. That gives me credibility mostly on the one-to-one or with the peers or the teammates I've had at those companies. So credibility is a big part of that. There's also the organic nature of the relationships that you've built. And so if Eric and I have 15 years of, friendship and, he comes in, he's like, wait, great point. He's not going to do that for a stranger. He's going to do that for someone he knows and, he believes in. And so you have to have those relationships to be able to create that snowball effect and that cascading effect. You can't just walk in and be like, hey, I'm going to be a thought leader one day and assume that people are just going to lock. It helps if you've got a brand. It helps if you've got a story to tell. But for the most part, most ad tech companies are kind of boring, right? You can't dress it up on Instagram. It's very much a B2B story, not a B2C story. So you lose that as a medium, which is where most people are telling their stories and their lives and spending their time when they're not thinking business. And so, again, I come back to there are things you can think about in terms of just, being top of mind, but it's not like if you're an SSP, you've got one strategy. If you're a DSP, you've got another strategy. If you're an agency, you've got another. And if you're a startup, you've got a fourth.
I tell clients, you need two ingredients. You need provocative takes, or at least the ability to get there. Obviously part of the marketer's job is to help them brainstorm, right? And be like, here's what's going on in the industry and here's what I think we should be commenting on. But they need to have the willingness to go there and say something interesting. Sometimes it is it's just a dry well and you're like, oh shit, where's the water? So they need to have the willingness to go to that space and to be a little provocative. And two, they need to be willing to engage.
I totally agree with that. I think the other part of it is the human element, right? And the ability to forge relationships that go above and beyond the industry that we're in. And so it's not uncommon for me to be like, the Knicks just blew a lead. Or, I think Arena Sabalenka is going to win the US Open. And, I think that's where you start to really solidify those relationships. I mean, Joe, you're a prime example, right? We began our conversations talking about tennis. I had no idea who you were. Now you've got, a great franchise that you're building, but it all began because we shared a love of tennis. Right. And so, I think the other big takeaway here is you don't have to be all business all the time. Right. The best way to actually, forge those relationships. And Eric and I were laughing about this recently because the best thing that he and I have done over the past 15 years was
We went to watch The Throne at MSG.
right.
For those
Kanye West.
uninitiated, it's the Jay-Z Kanye West album. God knows when that actually was.
Your coolness in my young millennial estimation just rose significantly. So congratulations.
Eric was laying his best for Carter Kishi.
I am so happy to finally book a cool win with you, Joe. You have no idea. I've been taking a lot of L's lately.
Matt, so you left Index Exchange some time ago. As a lot of folks know, you're looking at other opportunities in the space. Obviously, you don't need to tell us about individual companies, but what sorts of opportunities in the industry are exciting to you right now? Like what spaces are you looking at and talking about?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think I had a kid 18 months ago and, I went from being Matt the ad tech guy to Matt the dad, as I mentioned earlier. And so, that transition doesn't just happen naturally. I think I was ill prepared to be a dad. I don't know that there's a right time for anyone. But, for me, it was like a great opportunity to stop, pause, reflect, hang out with my kid, watch her become this little human, and also take stock in who I want to be moving forward. And so, in a moment where I left in June, and I think I'm really, really lucky to be able to stop, pause, and look at this industry from the outside and think objectively, what's happened over the past 6 months? A lot. And, whether it's consumer shifts to video, whether it's a new administration, whether it's concern over regulation, whether, you're thinking about shifts between the buy side and the sell side, it's a great opportunity to sit down and, and talk to people. And so, I think from my perspective, to be a great executive, you have to understand your operational market. You have to understand the capital market and have some level of financial literacy in this industry. And then regulation is the outlier, which I think people tend to sleep on, but is going to ultimately have a ton of influence on how people transact. And so when I look at the ad tech industry that Eric and I grew up in, because, again, we're old. Sorry, Eric. That industry is probably in its third wave, would you say, right now?
Yeah, that's how I characterized it. Yeah.
I go between, are we, in the CTV generation that we're in today, or the chapter, are we in the early stages, middle stages, or is there consolidation and imminent change to come, which I think there is? So from my perspective, what's super interesting right now, the mid-market is really, really interesting. I see a ton of companies that, when I'm talking to founders, CEOs, or executives, they think that my relationship with holdco executives is really valuable to them. And while, I have a very unique Rolodex and sit with people who run big agencies all the time, to me, that's a bit of Mount Everest, right? It's the hill that companies go to die on at a certain stage in their evolution and maturation. And what I think right now is really interesting is the notion of differentiated demand and how you can start to pack that in. And so, I'll come back to Matt the contrarian who loves Google, right? I have the utmost respect for Google as a company. And Matt, the guy with a large social following, sometimes doesn't understand why I heap praise on Google. But over the past 25 years, which isn't a long period of time, they built, I would say, the greatest business of my lifetime, right? And they've done it by tapping into small mid-market businesses and making it really easy for those guys to buy media and transact across different formats and different channels. How do you emulate that in the open web? That's super interesting to me. There are a bunch of companies that are solving for it. It's a lot easier to get traction with them than it is to go walk into one of the big holding companies and try to get a strategic deal. Eric, you can speak to this. I mean, you're talking to these companies all day, every day.
Yeah, for sure. I think you summed it up quite well in that, The field is much more open when you start to go past the enterprise. Like everybody, I think justifiably like wants the enterprise client base, wants the brands and the logos, but they don't recognize that for companies like Meta and Google, they have millions of customers, and no one customer could be at all like dangerous to their business if they go away because of the strength and diversity and large client base and the fact that they are de facto performance businesses. So yeah, agreed. There's real opportunity in mid-market and SMB. On the other side of the coin, very hard to kind of capture and scale 1 million plus customers, but that's a different conversation.
I also think that, look, like, fair disclaimer, my wife works at a holding company, but I totally believe that the holding company model will not look like it does today 5 years from now. And so with that in mind, if I'm thinking about where Matt, the executive, wants to land, I want to think about where that is going, not where it's been. And far too many of those conversations feel like they're very much outsiders trying to understand the Holdco land rather than understanding or listening to what Holdco executives are talking about for the future of their business, or who is complementary to what they do and potentially who is competitor. And I think that part really informs a lot of how I'm approaching my search today.
Yeah, Matt, you had a great tweet about this where you said something about like, disrupting the agency holdco model being the hill that so many ad tech companies have died on. It's a tough system to disrupt and a tough market to compete in. Whereas I think it is more exciting to think about the open web, especially with the emergence of AI and the changes in CTV, as an overall opportunity that can shift significantly, partly by bringing in those performance advertisers, the e-com brands, and the SMBs that AppLovin has built a huge business catering to and is like focusing on even more. And that obviously Google and Meta have built huge businesses on the back on.
I don't want to talk a lot about my journey over the past 25 years because it's been long, but there are a few hallmark moments that I can think of that stick with me. One of which was trying to build a self-serve ad portal at MySpace in 2008, 2009, so that SMBs could come in and tap into what at that point was 80% of all page views on the web, and not have to go through an agency, but could swipe a credit card, right? How do you remove the friction? That was a great lesson to be learned. The second was my time at Ad Colony in the mobile ecosystem, where when I got there, we were a young, I don't know, we're on a $25 million run rate. 6 months later, we're on a $100 million run rate. We sold. Understanding the value of performance and understanding how performance marketing is really where the money is in digital, but Holdco money gets all the glamour and attention. And so when you think about the reality of, that delta, and again, I'll come back to perception and reality, the perception is you want to go walk into Dentsu and, talk to the leaders at Microsoft or AB or P&G. But the reality is there's probably far more money in the performance markets to be had. And so, again, without talking in specifics about the types of companies, I think that, ultimately there's a far bigger TAM in performance, especially as you start to think about changes in addressability and lessons that can be learned from AppLovin and how they've had to shift their model coming out of ATT than anything else as you move into a world without cookies and with different signals and with alternative identifiers, and how those lessons can be applied moving forward.
I'd like to connect that to the conversation we've been having the whole time, which is how influence can be measured from a performance perspective, right? Because we're all in business, we're all trying to drive to outcomes. How have you seen, and you don't need to get specifics in terms of like companies and deals or anything like that, how have you seen influence like drive outcomes and whatever you might define outcomes as? And maybe it's not like landing a sale, but it's like building pipeline, opening up new relationships. You kind of get what I'm saying?
Yeah, I totally get it. I think sometimes I like to joke that I'm chief concierge officer because, this is a team sport. And so, if I'm on your team, I'm here to help you be better. right? So if a sales guy is trying to get into a publisher and I can make a call for them, great, right? If that leads to a big deal, better. Same thing goes for the demand side. Same things goes for, vendors in between. But the best example I can give you is, I spent 7 years at AdColony collectively. The first 4 years we had exited, pretty healthy exit in 2014. I fulfilled my earnout. I left. 18 months later, I got a call because the company was in distress. And, the CEO of Otello, which was the parent company of AdColony at that point, called me up and he said, hey, come in and help us tell a better story. And so in an unorthodox way, I took global marketing under my domain, which is something I'd never done before. I'd been very much a spokesperson and a frontman for the band, but I'd never actually run a marketing organization. And so I sat down with a very talented individual who worked for me. And I said, let's go hire a great partner, someone like Joe Zappa. But Joe Zappa at that point wasn't Joe Zappa and in this business. He was trying to figure out what this business meant. And I said, here's what I want to do. I want to go find a great comms team that can help me get in front of every reporter and editor at every major trade in the space. I want to sit and have lunch. I want to become best friends with all of them. And they're like, what are you going to talk about? I'm like, anything they want to talk about. And, really the long story short here is AdColony went from being a company that was sort of an afterthought to a company that was part of every article and conversation for a good year and a half period where, yes, the Matt Barash brand was very much out there, but it was out there to promote and make AdColony look like it was the most forward-thinking player in this space. And it wasn't a company that was only doing a couple $100 million in top line, but it was far bigger in terms of perception and the number of places that we played. And so where did that land us? It landed us with an exit to Digital Turbine in 2020 and pretty good outcome, right? And I think a lot of that came from, the relationship with the press, getting really close to becoming the first phone call or maybe the second phone call when there was a breaking story. And so whether that was a hire and, some high profile executive moving on to another company and having a thought or saying something nice about them, whether it was talking about addressability or whether it was talking about just mainstream ad tech, even though mobile was way off to the side, ultimately it got us on the radar of a bunch of strategics who started to look at the company as being far bigger than it was because we were everywhere. And so that was a big outcome.
That's an outcome.
Terry was on the pod and he said, there's perception and reality and only one of them matters. In this case, it's, perception ultimately drives reality, right? Like a huge part of marketing is you look way bigger than you are, and then that drives significant outcomes. So,
Which goes for both of us, right? We look way bigger. We're not big guys, but we look really big.
Exactly. All right. Well, thank you very much, Matt.
Thank you guys. I think it's been great doing this. And, you've built this amazing franchise and, it feels like you've done it overnight. And I think it's really a privilege and a pleasure to be a part of it. So thank you for having me and letting me tell my story.
Yeah, Matt, this has been awesome. And I think the listeners are going to get a lot out of it. Where can people find you for advice, counsel, a good word?
I love coffee, right? Cups of coffee. They can find me at MJ Barash on X or Matt Barash on Instagram, Barash.
Awesome. All right. Well, with that, Joe Zappa, Matt Barash, thank you. And we'll see you all next week. Bye-bye.